Hello, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us and recognising the importance of such a topic for this evening. My name is Kirsty Stewart and I'm chairing this event. I'm an associate at Irwin Mitchell Solicitors. I have a few housekeeping things just to start off with. So we have a lot of people who've joined us this evening, which we're really pleased about, and we'd love as much participation as possible. Some people have sent questions in advance, but we do also have a chat function, so do feel free to pop any questions that you might have as we're going through in the chat function. We do have some time at the end to answer questions, and we will try and get through as many as possible. If it is directed towards a specific speaker, then do say that as well. The format is going to be rather different to your typical webinar this evening, so we don't have many slides, albeit that you can see one now, but I wanted this to be more of a discussion between people with varying experiences and create something which hopefully is going to be really interesting and innovative. I've chosen the speakers based on their ranges of experience, and I'm so grateful that they've agreed to attend and share their views. And albeit that I know that everyone has their general perspectives, and I know some of those, none of what we're going to say so far has been planned in particular, and we've not discussed it in advance, so I think it's going to be really interesting. So we're going to start off with each speaker setting out who they are, and if you could just go to the next slide, please. And I think that will really help for those that don't know us, and also their opening remarks on the topic as a whole. So I'm joined this evening by Dr. Chris Ince, who's a consultant psychiatrist, Isabel Garner, who's a parent campaigner and expert by experience, Ben McCormack, who's a barrister from Garden Court North Chambers, and Anne Early, who's another amazing parent and expert by experience. Then, after we've done our introductions, I'm really pleased that Anne's then going to do a couple of minute presentation for us. And I'm really pleased Anne could join us because she actually has a family member who was at Winterbourne View. As everyone will be aware, Monday the 31st of May will be the 10-year anniversary of the BBC Panorama programme exposing the awful abuse at Winterbourne View. I can certainly still remember the first time I watched it. It's absolutely etched in my brain, and I cannot even fathom how that would have felt, not just to know somebody who was there, but actually being your child. So since then, there has in fact been other units where abuse has unfortunately been exposed, and it continues to be so. When anybody goes into hospital, you expect to be helped and supported for the reason you're going there. And no one would ever willingly or otherwise agree to their loved ones being detained, knowing that they would have been treated as though they were less than human. This issue is not going away. And as we stand, there are still more than 2,000 people detained in mental health inpatient units, which are also known as assessment and treatment units, which Winterbourne View and Walton Hall are both one of those. Now, that is not to say, of course, that people are abused at every ATU, and that is certainly not the take-home message here. But with the average stay being around, I think, 5.6 years, it leads you to question why, and is that really necessary? What is the benefit that those people are gleaning from being there, and how do we unpick some of the main issues? All of us have varying experience and perspectives on this, and that is what I'm hoping that we can explore this evening. Most people in ATUs are detained subject to the provisions of the Mental Health Act. We've seen that there has been a recent white paper considering the Mental Health Act, and there's a whole section about autistic people and those with learning disabilities. It's unclear at the moment about how the government's going to amend the Mental Health Act, but there is a call and a drive to make it much harder, or even impossible, some say, to detain somebody who's autistic or has a learning disability under the Mental Health Act. One thing that some are questioning is the Mental Health Act, and is that part of the problem? Does it afford people the right legal safeguards, or are there alternatives? And this is the discussion that we're going to be having. So after the opening remarks, we'll hear, like I said, directly from Anne, and then we're going to have some topics. So the topics are as follows. So the first one is a discussion around what has or hasn't changed over the last 10 years and why the numbers in ATUs might not be changing. Then we're going to move on to the legal safeguards under the Mental Health Act and Mental Capacity Act and how they differ, and any views on that. and then moving on to what's happened on the ground to try and improve things, and the way that we're all challenging matters and the impact from an inside perspective as well. And then finally, we're going to have a chunk of time to take questions from yourselves. I do apologise in advance if we don't necessarily get to everyone. I'm going to try and pick a range of questions, and if you do have a question that needs to be answered, then do feel free to email. I'm also very active on social media, so I will pop my Twitter in the chat as well. Although, just to say, it's not just a work account. I do tend to tweet a lot about my experience as a lawyer, but also as a carer for my mum, who's got a rare type of dementia, and I'm also a parent carer to 2 son children. Right, so let's get started with the opening perspectives. Let's pass over to, let's start with Dr. Chris Ince, who can give an introduction about who he is and what his general perspective is.
My name is Chris Ince. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I'm based up Newcastle way, and I work within a service called Mitford, which is a national referral autism service for adults. And I've been a consultant psychiatrist. I dual trained in learning disability and forensic psychiatry, so I've worked both within non-secure and also secure services at a range of levels of security up to high secure for people with learning disability and ASD. I think it's probably enough about me. I also do a range of work for the corporate Section 12 approval and approved function status under the Mental Health Act, but also from the perspective of some things for the court protection and mental health Act as well.
Fantastic. So shall we move on to Isabel? Would you like to introduce yourself and who you are?
No, can't unmute myself.
Oh,
you can hear me. Apparently I'm not unmuted on my computer, but I'm glad you can hear me. Sorry about that. So I'm a parent of a young person who was in an inpatient unit. He's autistic and has a learning disability and other co-occurring conditions. I'm a parent advisor on the NHS England Learning Disability and Autism Task Force, and I'm an expert by experience on care education and treatment reviews. I'm campaigning ardently for homes not hospitals because of my lived experience, and I work with other charities like the National Autistic Society, Respond and MenCap on those kind of projects. You asked us to sort of briefly set out what our views were. I'm astounded that it was possible to section my son under the Mental Health Act. He did not have a mental health illness, like many autistic people. He lives with anxiety on a daily basis, but that's to do with the world, the sensory and social world that he lives in, and not to do with him being dysfunctional. We were told he needed assessment and treatment in a hospital. He didn't receive it, and it turns out he didn't need it. What he did receive was seclusion, routine prone restraint, so that he could be injected with high-dose antipsychotics, a lack of self-care support, and he was starved in these places. I have heard some clinicians argue that sectioning under the Mental Health Act is preferable than sending a person with a learning disability or an autistic person to prison. But my question is it really? A criminal has more human rights than my son did when he was in an inpatient unit, and we were told by the RC that it was optimistic to have a discharge plan. He was not a criminal, he was in distress, and his sectioning was entirely predictable and preventable, and it was caused by unmet need. And that is not my opinion, or just my opinion, it is my opinion, but that actually is the conclusion of a case review that was commissioned by a former care minister. I think it's criminal actually to put people out of sight under lock and key in closed cultures because the right support isn't available in the community. And my family's experience of the Mental Health Act was that it permitted a closed culture and human rights abuse, and it allows autistic people and those with learning disability to be dehumanised, and it marginalises families. And the JCHR put it that we are the canaries in the mine to warn. And so, you know, my son now thankfully has the right support, but he shouldn't have had to have gone through the trauma that he lives with even today to get it. It's cheaper than an inpatient unit too. Sorry, that's really over 2 minutes, but I felt it was important to say.
Thank you, Isabel, and please don't ever apologise for explaining about your situation, because it's, you know, it's really interesting and it's really important that people hear your story. So thank you so much for agreeing to be here and for sharing your perspective. Ben, do you want to go next and kind of introduce yourself and kind of where your general perspective is?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Ben McCormack. I'm a lawyer in Manchester. I'm a barrister, and mainly these days I do work in the Court of Protection, where I'm acting for people who are the subjects of Court of Protection proceedings, the people who the cases are about, or their families. So I think as a lawyer I'm quite practical about the way I try and approach my cases. So I'm often sitting around thinking, what's the best way that we can get from the start of this case to the end of this case as quickly as possible. And so I'm actually quite a fan. My mind is open to everybody's arguments about this, but I'm quite a fan of the Court of Protection as a means to get things done. I don't think it's perfect by any means, and nor is the law that it has to apply, but I've worked in loads of other areas of law before I came to doing mental capacity work. And those disputes were mainly resolved in the county court or the high court. And in those cases, I feel like I was trying to do the same kind of thing, like sorting out people's entitlement to welfare support, housing support, social care entitlement. And that's kind of similar to what I'm often trying to do in Mental Capacity Act cases these days. And in those other courts, I can tell you that daggers are drawn very regularly. Things become really fighty. They become the kind of court cases that you think about when you imagine a bunch of lawyers getting together, where everyone just digs into their positions and everything becomes really hotly contested. And my take is the Court of Protection is a bit different. That's why I like it. That's why I've got into working in it over the last 6 or 7 years, because I think it's much better than a lot of other legal forums at solving the problem. So unfortunately, the Court of Protection only sees a very small proportion of the problems that it might potentially solve. But I think that's my starting point. And now, what I know from my experience, I've seen the Court of Protection play a reasonably significant role in the kind of problem solving that we're talking about today. Not that the judges in the Court of Protection can do everything that we might want them to. The judges haven't got a kind of broad, a blank sheet of paper to say this person shouldn't be in a hospital and I'm going to design a way out for them. But we can get a long way towards that, and I think as well as other tools that might be at our disposal that we can talk about as we go along. I've got a lot of time for the Court of Protection and as having a role to prompt some of that. So that's what as we talk along, I'll chip in with some of my ideas and experiences about how that might be something to contribute.
Thank you. Anne, do you want to go next and just introduce yourself, and then we can come back to you to do your presentation after I've done my one. Is that all right?
Yes, of course. Yes. I'm afraid I don't have anything lengthy to say, so am I live now? Is it okay to go ahead?
Yeah.
Hi. My name's Anne Early. I'm not a professional, I'm not particularly expert. I'm a mother who found herself in a situation that was quite frankly unbelievable. and we had no knowledge or experience and no tools to deal with. And it was horrendous. And I think that for anybody who has watched the programme or heard of Winterbourne View, then it probably is self-explanatory. So that's my bit, really.
Thank you, Anne. So, as I said earlier, I'm Kirsty Stewart, and I represent a range of individuals who wish to challenge decisions about either themselves or their families. So this is both those who lack capacity and those who have capacity. I work within several spheres ranging from court of protection, community care law, judicial review and human rights. My background is as a mental health lawyer, which I did for 5 years. So I use the knowledge from that to help with the more complex cases involving crossovers of Mental Health and Mental Capacity Act. And because of my background, I also lead in the firm on cases involving those in assessment and treatment units. And I'm also a very proud member of the Right to Home campaign group, as is Isabel. So this week we are doing 5 days of action, concentrating on different aspects, such as the broken promises that have been made by the government, what good support looks like, and there's also human rights, which is tomorrow. So we'll also be doing a Twitter question and answer at 3 o'clock tomorrow, if anybody would like to join us for that. I've worked within both spheres of the Mental Health and Mental Capacity Act for some time, and speaking as a previous mental health solicitor, I found that I had a real frustration and limitation on what I could achieve for some of the more complex cases that I came across. There was limits on legal aid funding, which meant that once you'd had a tribunal and the decision had come through, the legal aid just stopped. The criteria for detention was how it is now, albeit that that's obviously being reviewed. And so more often than not, the same result would happen, which is that the person fulfilled the criteria for continued detention and no community provision was available that was suitable. So everyone had it in their minds that that was due to the person's what's called termed, sort of challenging behaviours. And I just don't think it was ever really that simple. And this isn't a criticism necessarily of the tribunal process or of my previous training, but it's just more what I observed as being a lack of understanding around the Mental Capacity Act. And it was much more evident to me when I switched roles and started working within the court of protection sphere, and certainly at Owen Mitchell. There's always been, and has been seen in case law, an avoidance to merge the two areas, and for the COP to become involved historically in matters where the person's staying in hospital. But I think what we're starting to see, and certainly what Ben and I are sort of trying to do in our practice, is really push the boundaries on this. And we're really having some successes in this area. And, it isn't the typical carved out route sort of set nicely out in law yet. But I think where appropriate, we are able to take a new approach, and some people who have been detained in hospital for a long time and sort of stuck really in the position they are becoming unstuck by some of the things that we're able to do. And, it's not straightforward. It does take a range of kind of skills and jurisdictions, human rights, COP, JR, and also working collaboratively as well with families, mental health solicitors. But in my view, the COP does have a place for those people detained in assessment and treatment units to help to progress them towards discharge. And it can be really used as a way for accountability and to help to develop care packages, transition plans for those who would be subject to an authorised deprivation of liberty in the community. As a lawyer, it does appear at times like there is not a smooth process for transition in the community. I have often found care providers myself, and clearly that's not part of my typical role. But I do think it is important, though, for all parties to be acting collaboratively and to really keep the person at the centre of it, with their families and advocates' voices as loud as possible. And again, I'm not suggesting that every person who's currently in hospital should necessarily be subject to the Mental Capacity Act. But I do think it needs to be a recognised route and consideration which is undervalued and underused. In a meeting that I went to recently, actually, with some really important professionals, I was told that the court protection was slow and archaic. And I guess I just don't really see it like that. I mean, I can apply if we really needed to. We could apply and get a hearing on an emergency basis within just a few hours. to me, that's just not slow. You know, yes, not all hearings are within that time frame, but equally, you know, these aren't cases to rush. You know, these are people's lives, and actually it should be planned properly to be successful. I've seen that the COP has really allowed cases to be better managed, which has moved them and moved the person towards discharge and back into the community, as well as dealing with issues which go beyond the Mental Health Act. So when you're talking about contact that's restricted with a family, that goes beyond the provisions of, say, Section 17 leave, or when information is restricted and withheld from families without an apparent reason. These are kind of things that really the Court of Protection should be routinely getting involved in my view. So that's kind of where I come from, and sort of my position. So I'm going to pass over to Anne now, who's going to talk about her experiences and what her family has been through.
Sophie, thank you very much indeed. It is going to be a very personal account, I'm afraid, so I hope I don't bore you too much. On May the 12th, 2011, Simon arrived at the front door of his home. It was thrown open by Kelly, who was one of his support workers, who said welcome home and gave him an enormous hug. And there was nothing unusual in that, except that it had been 3 years since Simon had been home. Simon was born nearly 47 years ago now. It was a good-sized baby, and the nurse said she'd never delivered such a ginger baby. He had a mop of red hair, red eyebrows, and even red eyelashes, and it instantly made him very easily recognisable, though my mother always denied he was ginger, preferring to refer to his colour as Titian gold. Life followed a fairly familiar pattern with a small baby, and although he's always slow to reach his milestones, I was told that young mums do worry. Fast forward a few years and things became all too clear that the diagnosis of a learning difficulty was correct. And although there was no obvious cause, despite our many efforts to find a reason, Simon, as he grew older and progressed through to young adulthood, became harder to look after at home. And we took a conscious decision to find somewhere for Simon to live independently of ourselves, but in a home-like situation with good support and locally. It wasn't easy pre-internet days because there was no central register of homes or anything like that, and that just seems incredible now, but it was the case. But we had the assistance of a really good social worker, and we struck gold with a small husband and wife team who were opening up a 4-bedroom home in the next village. And it was a home. You would just think you had stepped into an ordinary domestic house. There was nothing that smacked of being an institution or anything like that at all. There was untidy things in the room, and there was a fire burning. It was lovely. Simon lived very happily here from the age of, well, he was just turned 18 when he went there with 3 others. His days were spent out and about, and 3 days a week he travelled with a support worker to a local town where he joined a team who maintained the gardens in the park and visited older people, helping them with heavier tasks in their own gardens. But I have to say, I think that it was generally the support worker who did the work, while Simon directed, chatted and drank coffee, and obviously a true manager in the making. In 2008, it became apparent that things were starting to go a little bit wrong, and Si was experiencing difficulties first thing in the mornings and at tea times. And the reasoning was that various people coming and going in different directions. There was a lot going on, and Simon wasn't getting the staff's undivided attention. So he got a little bit lost in the melee. So the owners increased the staffing just by a few hours at these pinch points, really, at these particular points where life was a bit difficult. And everything calmed down and all was going quite nicely. However, they'd been absorbing these costs themselves and quite understandably requested a small amount of extra funding, and it was refused. They brought in professional help, or the county brought in professional help, and we were told Simon would need to be sent away for an assessment for a few weeks. The care providers and ourselves were absolutely horrified, but I guess the beast had been awakened, and there was no stopping its inevitable destructive path, and it rolled on. After having been informed that Simon would be sectioned, which we actually had to look up, we didn't know what it meant. If we didn't agree, we had no choice. And on that understanding, on the understanding he would definitely be returning home, Simon left, leaving behind all his belongings and furniture to embark on what was to be a journey into the unknown. I can't even begin to understand how frightened and scary that must have been for him. Looking back, knowing what I know now, I'm still not sure that we could have done anything different ourselves. We didn't know enough to be able to prevent it. Simon moved reluctantly to a unit in Swindon, which was about 3/4 of an hour away. Here, for the first time in his life, he experienced restraint, or I can only call it assault. It's not restraint, it's assault to me. And if that happened to anybody out in the street or anywhere else, you'd be suing in a criminal court. We couldn't believe it. We were told that Simon had created several shocking incidents, and it was lucky that the police hadn't been involved. And we were appalled as nothing like this had ever happened before. Suffice to say that things didn't improve, but after a year the decision was made to move Simon to a smaller unit, slightly closer to home, where he could live in a semi-independent flat. Sadly, 2 of the staff who most frequently restrained Simon moved with him, so there was no fresh start. A year of treading water in this unit and a multidisciplinary team opted to move Simon yet again, this time even further away to Bristol, which was about an hour and a half away. I bumped into a senior nurse who had just returned from reviewing the unit. He pronounced it totally unsuitable, chaotic, noisy, and not what Simon needed, but he was overruled. We objected. Simon was sectioned, and thus in January 2010, he entered the now infamous doors of Winterbourne View. Much has been written about Winterbourne View, has been filmed and talked about. To many people, it was just a place on a map where dreadful things happened. To us, it was the treatment our son endured whilst there, the pain and the misery he went through that's cast a long, dark shadow over all our lives. My ex-husband died while Simon was incarcerated, and that added to the distress and suffering. And they were dark times with no end in sight until the Panorama programme was aired. We are, as a family, eternally thankful to the Panorama team. We have endless gratitude for the care and compassion they showed and still show. One of the reporters still visits Simon 10 years on. Simon has moved from his shared home to his own bungalow, which he rents from the council. Post-traumatic stress disorder has been diagnosed, and he is still haunted by his experiences. And sadly, I suspect he will continue to be. He started self-harming to a degree where he caused a small bleed on his brain through head banging. Nonetheless, his staff manage his challenges with care, compassion, imagination, and love. Some have been with him for over 20 years, and Kelly, who met him at the doorstep, now runs the local pub and welcomes Simon in for a pint. I really don't make any apologies for presenting it as a personal thing, because Simon is that. He's a member of our family, he's my son, he's a brother to my 2 other children, and he's a very, very proud uncle. And he is a person, he's not a number, he's an individual, and he has a right to live his life as best he can. He is challenging, it is difficult. His staff have never had to restrain him, ever. They've never had to beat him into submission or force him to the ground. They learn breakaway techniques, but they learn to treat him with respect and, as I say, with love. What else can I say? That's how it should be. It's had a lasting effect from Simon, and life isn't easy. Even now, we live on a knife edge, always wondering when something will occur that it will go wrong. It's always fragile, so fragile. Not just for Simon and our family, but we met at the court, we met other families that we've stayed in touch with. Our stories are different but so similar in so many ways. And this is the 21st century. Our children aren't necessarily sexy or good looking or pretty, but they are people. They have a right to live with dignity and in the community. So that's it really. That's our Simon. He's funny, enormous sense of humour. He's a larger than life character and is much loved. And I'll bump into someone and they say, oh, I saw your Simon in town the other day, or he was in the local co-op, or he's seen around. That's my safeguard for Simon, is that people know him and they see him. That's how it should be for everybody. It's not necessarily just being in a bungalow on their own. It might be in a small care home. It might be, you know, with other people, but they have that right. It's not rocket science to manage to get 2,000 people out of an institution. We're not talking about millions of people. We're talking about 2,000.
Thank you so much, Anne, for sharing that. And I can't imagine how hard that was for you to speak about it, and from such a personal perspective. No parent would ever want their child to be in that position, and I think it's so important that whilst we're talking and whilst, you know, we're kind of on this week leading up to it, that we don't forget and lose sight of that important anniversary on Monday. It'll be 10 years since the BBC Panorama programme was first aired. And that's really what the first topic is about. What has and hasn't changed since Anne's son was in an assessment and treatment unit over the last 10 years, and why haven't the numbers of those people massively changed? You know, there have been many government reports, initiatives trying to project to reduce the numbers. You know, we've all explored these ideas around transforming care, and it was developed to dramatically reduce those numbers, but they're not falling. And I think whilst COVID hasn't helped, these issues are much deeper. It's not just the last 12 months, 18 months. And really, so I guess, what are the problems, kind of from all of your perspectives? Where do you see that the problems lie? Dr. Ince, can I come to you first, and maybe sort of from an inside perspective, how you see this topic?
Unmute myself. I think I think it's a huge topic. It's a very big question, and I think there are a great many strands to it. I mean, if you take the process of transforming care, in so far as we want to say it's transform care, then there has been a significant reduction in the overall bed establishment, the bed availability of beds within the country. If you take the 2,000 people with LD, ASD who are currently inpatients within hospital, then about 40% of those are subject to Part 3 of the Mental Health Act, so they are placed there by the courts. And I think that we need to slightly stratify the population a little bit. I think the other thing to talk about is that as the number of beds within what would be previously deemed sort of specific learning disability services particularly has reduced, what we've seen is we've seen an increase in the number of people with learning disability and autism being admitted to mainstream mental health services over the course of the last 5 years. That's pretty much tripled. That doesn't necessarily mean that the level of care is better or worse, but what it means is that perhaps it's sort of shifted rather than had a fundamental impact upon it. I think the other thing to say is that the general detention rate under the Mental Health Act has gone up, and I think that from the perspective of inpatient admission, I don't think we can ever aim for there to be nobody who has a learning disability or ASD within inpatient services, because there is a percentage of the population without a learning disability or autism who are admitted into hospital because they require inpatient hospital care because of primarily their mental illness. And so that will also apply to people with LD and ASD for whom there is a greater incidence of comorbid mental illness of an equivalent level. So I think that there's a separation between why an individual is admitted and then also the legal framework by which that's done. We've got some data, 3-year longitudinal data about all admissions within our trust, and it's a large trust, for people with ASD and LD. And actually over that 3-year data period, our average length of stay is about 60 days. So it's not that long. And I think I think the two things that have happened are that admissions are much more task focused. So I think there has been a shift away from this perhaps 15, 20 years ago, sort of paternalistic, we'll admit someone into hospital and fix everything and keep them there for as long as we think they need to be there to learn life skills and etc. etc. And if that takes 15 years, then they're in a safe place, because we know that's not fundamentally necessarily correct. And I think the other thing is that, I mean, speaking as a consultant who works in learning disability and does on-calls and mental health assessments, I think my threshold for admission over the last 10 years has massively increased. It is very, very rare that I detain somebody into hospital for a primary diagnosis of learning disability or autism. The admissions to hospital are generally, or the vast majority, are around some form of comorbid condition for which there is a necessity for time-limited admission. And I think that's the advantage of that, is then the turnaround. And the difficulty is where someone is admitted as a result of placement breakdown. Placement breakdown is because then you have nothing to send them back to. You have nothing to discharge them to. And so I think for me, the huge focus in this, apart from the legal framework, which is primarily why we're here, is the discharge pathways. And I think that whatever we can utilise as a lever for that will be welcome. And I think that that's double-edged in terms of what would be potentially called a protection, what would be mental health act. I think the one thing I'll say before I shut up is my one concern, although perhaps it might be mitigated by the integrated care systems, is the funding stream that flows from Section 117 aftercare under the Act. And, you know, if we talk about the same population, but therefore we just, Lucy Series did a very nice blog on this, where she talked about the fact that actually it's a big bowl, and the mental health population, so the mental health population is a cup within that bowl, and if you shrink the cup, all you do is overflow into the bowl of mental capacity. So you may be talking about the same people, but I suppose the question is whether we can alternatively enshrine the access to funding, and funding that is not going to go away, because paring back of care packages is one of the biggest concerns, I think. And I'll mute myself.
Thank you. And I think that is definitely something that I find with some of the cases that I deal with, is that it's around community provision. It's around, there's a lot of issues around who's got responsibility of paying for future care, like who's going to do all those things. And there's obviously a lot of different funding streams as well, because you're potentially talking about Section 117 aftercare, depending on what section the person is currently detained under, possibly continuing healthcare, local authority funding, and how they all sort of interlink. And that's definitely something that we come across quite a lot in these particular cases. Ben, from your experience, what are the sorts of reasons do you think, kind of leading on from that have kind of caused the numbers not to be decreasing?
Yeah, just wait until I'm live. Can you hear me? Oh, Chris is nodding. Great, thanks. Okay, number one, it's hideously complicated. The law is just absolutely unfathomable. I mean, I'm working on it full time, and I've been a lawyer for 20 odd years, and it's just horrific. So that's number one. I mean, and I think practically what that means is it's really hard. I mean, I think it's a great success when me working with loads of other lawyers, you know, on legal aid certificates, you know, at public expense, managed to kind of knit together stuff that just should happen without lawyers' involvement, right? Lawyers' involvement is when something's gone wrong, usually, when something isn't happening fast enough. So the hideous complexity means that what you don't really then have is a very joined up approach. So if you're, for instance, thinking about somebody in an assessment and treatment unit and apt to be discharged from there, and what we're looking at is trying to find a community-based home for them of the kind that Anne and Isabel have been talking about, and we all know from our caseload is what the vast majority of families would want for their loved ones. So it's then really difficult. I mean, I can call it like a lack of a joined up approach, as though it's kind of somebody's fault, and I suppose there has to be some political fault somewhere for not creating a system that works kind of easily. That's what should be happening. But you just got to think, I mean, when somebody's in a hospital and they're going to be discharged, you've got the local authority, usually a CCG, the trust, sometimes the Ministry of Justice, a housing provider not yet in place but has to be kind of willing and prepared to work at the same rate, a care provider that, and in fact, I'll come to that in a minute, but those people all need to be working together at the same time, and that needs to be kind of synchronized and synthesized with itself. It's just, it's not easy. So I think the fact that the system is difficult to navigate and difficult to operate, even for people who work in it, is a problem. I think that my second point is, I read, Alfred, I can't remember who said this, but I thought it was a really good analogy for this area of law, which is that working through it and trying to navigate it is like playing whack-a-mole. Do you remember, if you know whack-a-mole from the fun fair, you whack one mole and then another one comes up. It's great fun when you're playing it. It's not great fun when you confront it in your work or in your life, as we're talking about today. So you get the responsible clinician agreeing, yeah, in principle, this young man should be discharged, but it's now finding him somewhere. And then, as I've had in a recent case, everybody who has a say in the matter effectively agrees the person should be discharged, but 3 years have passed. So, and that's because a lot of other moles popped up. It wasn't for the want of everybody trying, but it's because of each time you solve one little problem, another one might pop along, and I just think that happens an awful lot in this area. I think another one, this is by no means I don't want anybody to take this as a statement from someone who that I can be. I'm not an expert in this field, but I just think one of the things that really bugs me about this is whenever we're setting up a case or working on a case where we're trying to get somebody out of a kind of institutional environment into a supported living, community-based thing, I'm really surprised by how often commissioners of those care packages propose some enormous hedge fund funded corporation to be providing that care in a kind of one-stop shop, usually a former hospital. Now it's supported living flatlets for people. So officially, it'll need the Court of Protection to sign off on the deprivation of liberty. That's how supported the living is. It's not a care home anymore. It's not a hospital anymore. And I just find it really frustrating in this and in other areas of social welfare as well, how much of what we think of as state-funded stuff, the state's paying absolutely hideous amounts of money to an American hedge fund. And that's, yeah, I'm for the want of not libeling anybody, I won't name the names of these, but I see them in cases a lot. And when I ask for how much are you going to be spending on this supported living arrangement, the mind boggles. And one of the problems, as I see it, just based on my own case experiences, are that I think commissioners of these kind of packages tack towards that kind of arrangement. They know that perhaps they have reps come round to them and say, yeah, we can sort out, 20 of these a year for you kind of thing. We'll give you a very good price for it. And they see that as easier. They've got a relationship sometimes with those people, that they're the easier path to tread, rather than a small, perhaps a bespoke care package that is based in a community, based very local to a person's family. As Anne talks about, Simon walking around the local town centre, and friends and relatives of Simon and indeed Anne see Simon. So I saw your Simon down the other day at Morrison's, you know, he seemed to be in a good mood. That's not going to happen if he's living 50 miles away in somewhere that is a decommissioned hospital, you know. So, and what that means is that you might be dealing with a smaller, local to a family care provider, and maybe the CCG or the funding trust hasn't really heard of it, or they think they're a bit little. We haven't got an ongoing relationship with them, and so for me, I see that as a bit of a problem as well. I ought to say, I have come across lots of people actually who've been cared for by large, what I'm sort of rather cursing here, is institutional type care providers, and they have a great time, and it's a success. So I can't say that it never works, but I think my concern, and if you ask me why a family's still sitting with not much progress after Panorama 10 years ago or so, I think that's part of it. I think it feeds into the same concerns that I have about the way the NHS has been carved up and chopped off, and private providers get to provide stuff, and I think they have different motives to the public sector, properly so called. So there you go. Those are my thoughts, Kirsty.
Thank you, Ben. That's really really useful to obviously hear your experiences, and I think you're absolutely right about, you know, some of these providers, and again, you know, we're not saying this is a problem for every person in every scenario, and I think, you know, Ben and I get involved in cases where things have gone wrong, or in ways in which, you know, we need to have a legal arm, and again, it's not to say that each of these cases is necessarily going to you know, sort of go into the court arena, and that's absolutely not what we're saying. We're just kind of giving examples about those people and those cases that we have come across. I mean, so from Isabel, perhaps from the family perspective, and obviously you've got a real kind of, you know, knowledge both when your son was in a unit, but also now, and kind of reflecting on and communicating with a lot of other families around these kind of issues. How do you see this problem, and do you kind of want to add any other sort of reasons into that? Oh, Isabel, sorry, you're actually on mute. Sorry.
It won't let me unmute. Oh yes, great, thank you, Chris. It still says I'm muted for some reason. I do apologise. I think someone else has to give me the power remotely. So yeah, there's lots of things there, I think. First of all, I wanted to say that the number of children and young people has doubled since 2015, and that's very concerning. And also, I wanted to draw your attention to the chapter 20, section 20 of the Mental Health Code of Practice, which says that hospitals are rarely helpful for autistic people, and they're much more likely to get better, you know, even when they have a mental health illness, which many of them do not. Even when there is mental health illness, actually a familiar setting is better. So I really don't think that the hospital environment is helpful at all. And I also wanted to say that what hasn't changed is that we don't have the upfront funding that Sabab talked about, all that, you know, after Winterbourne View, to permit the right support in the community. The right support hasn't been built for everybody in the community, and that is why it takes 5.6 years on average to get somebody out of, you know, the trap door closes and that person becomes stuck in the system. And that's because the system is not fit for purpose. The system is totally broken, and in my son's case, they said that that his sectioning was predictable and preventable and caused by a failure in joint working between health education and social care. So really, what hasn't changed is that we need to have the right funding for the right, so that the right support can be built, and not put people away just because they don't, that their needs are not going to be fulfilled by the system currently, and that private hedge funds are in a position where they literally have a captive market and can make a lot of profit. That this it's an abomination, actually, and I find it really hard to accept that it is accepted, and that this is not the national human rights scandal that to me just seems so obvious. There's also the issue of the criminalisation of distressed behaviour of people who have learning disability or who are autistic. I was so moved by every word of what you said, Anne, and it resonated so deeply with me. And from the second he was released from that place, he was never again restrained, never again given antipsychotic medication, and never again secluded, ever. And that's not to say that he's not still challenged by his neurological differences. Of course he is, but it's like Anne was described so eloquently. He is treated like a human being with compassion and empathy and understanding, and not with a one-size-fits-all medical model approach. So I think precious little has changed, not enough has changed, and this is a human rights scandal.
Thank you, Isabel. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think this is something that I've been seeing actually increasingly in the kind of cases that I've been involved in, actually, is this idea of somebody going into hospital, perhaps just for a short period, perhaps they're being told they need an assessment or something very specific. And because their needs remain unmet, and particularly around sort of sensory needs, they might well react in a way which could be perceived by others as being challenging or adverse to how they sort of should be behaving, and then the issue of risk then sort of increases, and the idea then of restraint and restriction then increases, and you kind of go this very sort of upward trajectory. And I know that there's been cases, and I'm sure Ben will say the same thing, where we've got involved where, unfortunately, people are then talking about gatekeeping assessments into forensic settings, and in fact, I'm dealing with one right now that's sort of that exact issue, or people who are being assessed perhaps for going into even the high security hospitals like Rampton. Again, we've got a case that's doing that right now, and this is somebody who didn't start off with having any of those, what you might think of as being more criminalised behaviours, but it's more, the family's perspective is that it's more actually the impact of the environment and the continued unmet need, which is actually creating this problem. But that's also a barrier then for discharge, because then you need a care provider who's going to really see through that and actually be able to tackle that issue. But I think it also puts then the responsible clinicians and the doctors in a very difficult position, because they're then obviously seeing that and not sort of, and obviously I'm not trying to speak for Dr. Ince, and he could perhaps correct if he doesn't agree, but it's just more that I feel that they probably then are in this very tricky position of sort of seeing the increased risk, but then equally then trying to work towards discharge and perhaps not knowing how to necessarily get through some of those issues. I guess this is the way that I see it, kind of as like a lawyer's perspective. That's kind of what I see. Dr. Ince, would you sort of agree with that? Is that like something that you have to sort of battle and tackle, or?
Well, for those in the audience or on the panel, who know where the NHS service in which I work, where our referrals come to, and the patients who I am asked to see, either part of that or I occasionally get dragged into some of the judicially reviewed type stuff as well. And I think it's you know, there's so many significant points. The difficulty is, you know, code of practice is right. You know, if you take the work CQC's done around long-term segregation, then virtually every single case there of someone with long-term segregation, they have a diagnosis of ASD. And what we see is, you know, what we professionally refer to as behaviour as a challenge. Don't like that phrase. You know, it is a communication of distress. It is a response. It is a mechanism by achieving fight or flight. It is a manifestation of anxiety and distress. It is all of those things. And you know, someone if you are in a noisy audio environment and you have significant sensory sensitivities, and you know that by some form of aggression you are placed in seclusion, which is predictable and quiet and away from everybody else, and you get a high level of staff support and intervention and people to talk to regularly, and you remove all the other stuff, then you know you withdraw from that general ward environment. But what that externally, the perception of that is risk. That is a level of aggression. That is something that the system has to do something about. And then you see transition to PICU, or you see the gatekeeping assessment for low secure, and then from low secure the level of procedural and physical security increases, and the secure is an embargoed word. It's an NHS England word. And to be a secure service, you have to meet certain specifications, and there is no flexibility within that. Service I work in, it is built to the low secure standard. It's more robust than low secure standard, but we don't operationalize it like that because we have a back door for those people who can't do transitions of going through the unit. You know, we can unlock all the doors and throw all the airlock open. It's not an airlock, it's a controlled lobby. It keeps people out rather than keeping people in. And we can remove that as a transition point. But if we do those things, we can't be called low secure because we don't meet the standard. I don't want to be low secure, I want to be able to individualise care. But the difficulty is that when you get someone within a low secure, rapidly, they're usually being referred to medium secure. And then you're down a pathway, a very forensic pathway, a very well-worn, regimented, risk-averse pathway. I know for certain of my patients, if they do something that is like, I'm going to get shouted at for using the word aggressive, but that's how it's categorised on the incident report. If I have a patient who does something that is categorised as aggression, then usually what it means is we need to get them out and doing something else, not actually imposing more restrictions, because it means we're not meeting their needs. And I come at this from as a service that can do these things, and I know that most services don't and can't. So I think that there is a need for a degree of inpatient care, but as Ben said, the problem is that there is a large amount of warehousing. There is a large amount of services being changed from rehabilitation inpatient to residential with nursing care, and they're exactly the same. But they're differently badged and they're a different legal framework, and because it falls under the Code of Protection, there's community. I think that it's culturally very hard to change. I think there have been some shifts, and I think that sorry, I'm being distracted by my wife's on a yoga retreat, and I'm left with. I don't know if anyone saw my little 3-year-old pop his head in at one point. He was unhappy because he couldn't have any more marshmallows, and now she's ringing me to FaceTime the boys before they go to bed. So I shall stop there. I shall pause, turn my camera off, and go and take my phone to the kids so they can FaceTime their mummy. See, I'm human. I am human, honest. I've had some heart. I shall return very momentarily.
Thank you, Dr. Ince. Of course you're human, we all are. And I think, we're all facing the difficulties of working from home, aren't we, and balancing family and family life. And, we could all have a BBC News moment at any moment. So obviously do excuse that, we are all trying to do what we can. But what I do think is that actually Dr. Ince was linking very nicely into our next topic, which is more talking about the protections under the Mental Health Act and Mental Capacity Act and how they differ, and any kind of views on that. And again, we've each got different perspectives because we've each come at this from a different way. I think just sort of for as sort of a general overview, I guess for people who are subject to the Mental Health Act, there are specific rights of appeal which depend on the section that you are detained under. You can appeal against your section if you weren't happy, and there are also references, so automatic tribunals for people who haven't appealed after a certain period. And again, this all very much depends on which section that you're actually placed upon as to what those timescales particularly are. I'm not going to kind of go into all of those now, but so there are those safeguards there. You can appeal to the tribunal and also the hospital manager, so there's sort of two routes there. Also, for any CQC registered placements, there's also a route of complaint that way. So if you're detained under the Mental Health Act and wanted to complain that way, that will be a route, or via things like PALS. There's also, under the Mental Health Act, rights of nearest relatives, although I will obviously ask Isabel in a moment kind of whether nearest relatives, and Anne actually, if she's okay to answer that one, whether they actually know what their rights are under the Mental Health Act when their loved ones are detained. There's also the use of things like CTRs and CETRs, depending on whether the person is under or over the age of 18. But again, are they being used correctly? And I think this is, one thing that we're sort of looking at. And I think what I see is more that the Mental Health Act, and I'm not saying for every person and every situation, that's certainly not at all what the message is here, but I think there are certain people who would benefit more from being under the Mental Capacity Act, because under the Mental Capacity Act you have access to the Court of Protection, and obviously that's dependent very much on the person lacking capacity to make the relevant decision. So again, it's not applicable to everybody, but it would be interesting to know how many people in assessment and treatment units are subject to the Mental Capacity Act and whether that actually does make better changes. I mean, for example, if you had concerns about a particular care package and the person was under the Mental Capacity Act, so was under a standard authorisation in a unit which was registered by the CQC, you could either make an application as the person involved, or you could make an application as a family member. So from a family perspective, you could do that. If they were under in a community placement, so it wasn't CQC registered, then again, you'd be able to do those options and be able to take the matter to the Court of Protection and say, I'm not happy about this particular aspect of my care package. It's overly restrictive. There is restraint being used. There is something in the care package which isn't suitable, and just, I'm really concerned about it. And I guess that's kind of what I try and achieve for some of our clients and what we're sort of doing, because actually it does have successes that way. And again, not all circumstances. In both actually the Mental Health Act and the Mental Capacity Act, you can obtain independent reports. We often use them in Court of Protection, and we get independent psychiatrists, independent social workers, like a wide range of those people. And both processes have reviews. So under DOLS, you can have annual reviews for that if you're not appealing in between that. Like I said, with the Mental Health Act, you have references, but they can be every 3 years, depending on how long you've been in hospital for. So it really does kind of vary. I mean, both obviously have positives and negatives. And I guess that's just a very sort of, quick sort of, 2 minute of what both acts are and what they can put across. Do you want to go to, should we go to Isabel first? Just maybe to say from the family perspective, and obviously your family member was subject to the Mental Health Act. So how, like, did you know about nearest relative rights? Is that something that you use? Like, how did you see the safeguards as produced under the Mental Health Act?
It's very complicated, and obviously, like Anne said, we're not lawyers, you know, but what it meant for us in practice was that, you know, at the time when it happened, we didn't know about our rights, and those weren't explained to us. But you know, looking back and finding out later, a lot of what the Mental Health Code of Practice, the safeguards, etc., like advocacy and all of that should have happened, didn't happen. And so when we talk about safeguards, these places seem to be a law unto themselves, and overwhelmingly for us as a family, it was an utter shock to be marginalised and to have our son dehumanised and not be able to do anything about it. And we did raise concerns. We did bang on all the doors. We made complaints. We got in touch with the CQC. We got in touch with NHS England. We did everything that we possibly could. And in the end, the only way that we found was to go to the media, actually, to get our son out. And no parent wants to do that. It was absolutely terrifying. But we felt we had no other avenue. And you know, we did have tribunals. We did say we want to discharge, we want him to be discharged, but they weren't going to let him be discharged because no one was willing, you know, they said there's nowhere else for him. There's nowhere else. And actually, we found where his current, you know, we were the ones that found where he was going to go, and it took us 18 months to get him out. But, you know, it would have taken a lot longer had we not gone to the media. I'm convinced of that, and that's not right. And I don't know whether the Mental Capacity Act would be able to do something about that stranglehold on a person. You know, the kind of the scrutiny of that person's care. Whether it would enable, you know, whether it would be able to smash apart the closed cultures and the lack of accountability that there seems to be. It is the most terrifying thing to feel like your child is in danger and there is absolutely nothing you can do to protect them, and you have to walk away and leave them in that place. And that is just, that has to stop. And I can't see, I mean, I don't know, I'd like to understand how the Mental Capacity Act can do that better than the Mental Health Act, but really I can't see how that is going to change without the right funding, without social care, health and education actually working jointly together, and without the investment in social care that we absolutely need, which is not, my husband was the nearest relative, and that meant that, you know, all because he was the oldest parent, it was everything had to go through him. He doesn't need a hospital. He didn't need a psychiatrist. What he needed was to be out, being busy, and doing stuff that mattered to him, so that he could feel safe and happy. And it's not. As you said, Anne, it's not rocket science, is it? And it's a damn sight cheaper than the £13,000 that reportedly it costs per week to keep my child under lock and key. It's an abomination. It's disgusting. It really is. Anyway, sorry. It's hard to be emotional even now, 5 years on nearly. And the fact that it's been a decade since Winterbourne View, and this is happening to people I know, the families that I know, it's still happening.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, Isabel. You know, this is, and I think it is going to take that kind of collaborative approach of all of those agencies together. Anne, did you want to come in and sort of add anything to what Isabel's saying about sort of the family perspective and how it was, you know, when you were going through it? How did you see the use of the Mental Health Act, and did you kind of, use your nearest relative powers, and how did all that sort of happen for yourselves?
We can't hear you, Anne. I think
Anne's muted.
someone needs to unmute you, maybe.
Talk, Anne, I think we can hear you.
No, we can't. Something peculiar is going on.
Just whilst that's being sorted out, maybe we'll jump to Ben, and then we'll come back to Anne. But if someone perhaps behind the scenes could just help Anne and sort of sort that out. But so let's jump to Ben then. So Ben, sort of from like your perspective, I know that you have quite a similar viewpoint to me around this issue. So maybe for families like Isabel's and things, kind of, could you sort of go into a bit more about how the Court of Protection and Mental Capacity Act perhaps could sort of impact?
I mean, one of the, I think I said this at the outset, is that the law shouldn't have to be the principal solution to these problems. It should be happening anyway. I think, as perhaps Isabel said a while ago, that these are human rights issues, really, but that doesn't mean that they need to be going anywhere near a court. And I suppose I approach all this knowing that when I get a case, there's a problem. Like, I don't get, like any lawyer really, we get cases when somebody says, well, the system isn't working properly, so we need to see a lawyer, and they have to be skilled up enough to know that there is law in this area, that there are lawyers who they can get legal aid often, that there are things that can be done at cheap or no cost to people, and not most people don't know that. But the other thing that I think is worth bearing in mind about whenever we think about the law in this area is there's three things really. There's what we wish the law would say, and that has to tie in with what we wish kind of society would provide in terms of, as I think Isabel said a minute ago, in terms of the kind of provision of the amount of money and effort and housing. But so there's the law as we wish it might be. There's the law as it's going to be soon, because both of the acts are being reformed. We've got the LPS, the Liberty Protection Safeguards, so that's changing the DOL system as of next April. And we've got the reform to the Mental Health Act as well. So the laws that we're talking about, the two acts that we're talking about, are themselves changing, and that will make a difference if we came back in a year or two to what we thought was the most practical way. But then there's the law as it is right now on the 25th of May 2021. And as a lawyer who deals with cases as they come to me, I'm interested, I of course want to look down the line, because some of these things take a long time to come to fruition. But really, when I look at today, if as I had a couple of weeks ago, a case comes onto my desk, which is where a solicitor like Kirsty, who knows how to navigate this, has worked out and has done some initial negotiation via the mental health tribunal proceedings to find out that this person in a hospital is ready to be discharged, and the RC would discharge them, would support their discharge if only there was somewhere suitable for them in their town. So that's the facts. The next question is, well, how's anybody going to find them somewhere? And my kind of t-shirt slogan is, the Court of Protection is actually quite good at doing that. The Court of Protection can't do the finding, right? A judge doesn't sit and say, well, by the way, I've found somewhere in this case last month, and therefore I'm going to make that's going to be now provided for you. Of course, we all know that isn't the Court of Protection's, its jurisdiction doesn't extend to it actually making any decisions about what should or shouldn't be provided by a trust or a CCG at all. The court has no power to do that. But you know what it really can do? And this is one of the things that I found kind of surprising when I came into this area of law, but also quite optimistic, because I'm like solution based, right? In what I do, we've all talked an awful lot about all the problems. And when I get out of bed in the morning, I'm thinking, well, what's the solution then? Because otherwise there's not much point in me being there unless I'm attempting a solution. So the Court of Protection can give directions. That sounds like a really boring sort of case management lawyer thing. The court can give a direction to some public body or other, saying, can you tell me what the options are for this young man whose RC says he could be discharged into the community if only there was somewhere for him? And by the way, in fact, before you put that all down in a statement, could you have a best interest meeting at which the family will have the family round and have the potential commissioners of care and the housing provider. You can all sit around the table, talk about it, and then you put me down a statement, and you wouldn't believe how that spotlight on somebody, it doesn't make them reach a particular decision, but what it makes them do is to listen to all the options, listen to the other views around the table, and that discursive process that the court is effectively directing. The court doesn't need often to have the power to make somebody decide something. The fact that the court asks the question, and it's the court, it's not me or Kirsty or somebody's mum, important as particularly people's families are. It's not even, Chris, it's not even the RC in the hospital who's saying, this guy shouldn't be here. But it's a judge, and ultimately, this isn't a perfect solution, because what happens, in my experience, is that quite often, by the time a case gets to court and a judge gives some directions, nothing more than that, that pulls the file effectively to the top of the pile. So that's actually a really inefficient way for a system to run, but it's a practical solution for an individual. So it's not how you design a system. You wouldn't design a system for the fair kind of allocation of resources and the fair sort of just human rights of citizens that says that the people who can wind their way to a court, find a good solicitor, find somebody who can kind of get them in front of most court protection judges are cooperative at this kind of thing, in my experience, get them in front of a knowledgeable judge. That's not a system working, but here we are now. As I said, we can think about, there are plenty of other times we can, and far wiser, more creative lawyers than me and other people too can think about how we design a better system, but that's like years, that takes ages. And here we are now today, and we've just got to do the best with what we've got. So I find I'm all ears for mental health lawyers telling me that there are loads of great things in terms of securing a move out of hospital that can be done via the law in the Mental Health Act. If that's possible and that's working, I'm not going to stop anybody doing it. For my part, I see a role, I'll put it that way, and I think it's quite an important role in the right case for the court of protection in sort of filleting out those options. And I just think that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say really that when a judge asks you to sit down to collaboratively work, people tend to do it. When it's in court, and not just because this is the point I made at the outset as well, and then I'll leave it there. The point I made at the outset is that in the court of protection, the atmosphere is just a little bit less contentious and argumentative than it is in other legal forums. Certainly in terms of judicial review cases where we're challenging a failure to do something. You should have done this. The law says you should have done it by now, and you haven't. You find the local government or health body who's been accused of unlawfulness is going to have to pay out a load of money if they got it wrong in terms of legal costs. They tend to fight quite hard on that. Get the same people arguing about the same thing in a court of protection case, and you have all sorts of red lines being crossed all the time by people. People saying, I started off thinking this, I've listened to the debate, I've changed my mind. And it's a wonderful thing in law to see that happening, because lawyers are not really, lawyers imagine when we go through our training that we're all going to be in disputes all the time and that we're going to be fighting, you know, like a boxing match, like a Crown Court trial. This area of law really doesn't, at least in my experience, operate like that. So that's why I think that the Court of Protection has a role to play. I can't pretend it's a solution. I think it's a very imperfect system that the Court of Protection is presently a part of. But here, listen, I don't make the rules. Here's where we are, right? And if somebody like Isabel or Anne came to me and said, this is what's happening to my kid, that will be part of my solution package. So, yeah.
Thanks, Ben. That's really helpful. And I think we've managed to fix Anne's technical issues there. So, Anne, just sort of again, from your perspective then, how did the Mental Health Act play a part with your family, and how did you use that, or not?
We were totally ignorant of the system. We had no experience. We didn't even know what to go out and look for, because we didn't know it. We didn't know what was there. We didn't know what we had to do. My ex-husband was deemed, because he was the elder, he was the one who was who took responsibility. And it was fortunate that we'd maintained a good relationship and a good friendship, because otherwise I dread to think how it would have been. We finally managed to find, we went through umpteen solicitors who hadn't got a clue, wouldn't touch it, didn't know what to do about it. Finally found someone who did, and then it turns out they'd actually worked in conjunction with the hospital before. So we kind of didn't exactly trust them very far. So from a legal point of view, that was it. We were lucky enough to have an advocate who was wonderful. But other than that, nothing. And what we found afterwards, this is a really sickening thing. If we had known, I managed to get a deputyship order for Simon for financial, but also for health and welfare. And that gives me back the power that as a parent we had assumed that we had. We didn't realise we no longer had that power, because we don't treat Simon as a child, but he is still a child, and he's still our child, and he will always be that. And we had no idea that power had been taken away from us. And I use power because I can't think of another word, authority maybe, because we didn't use it in a way that exerted power. We used it in Simon's best interest. And I feel now that having that deputyship order, it safeguards Simon. It gives me, and my other son has also, we're joint deputies. So he is there to carry that on when I'm not. But we had to expend a great deal of money, but it was the best money we ever spent. And that shouldn't be something that you find out by accident after the event. That really shouldn't. Had we had that power, had they been forced to cooperate with us, to talk to us beforehand, I think the outcome, I'm not sure it would have been any different, but we would at least felt that we had more strength to our elbow, if you like, and more ability to influence the situation. It's your helplessness. You're treading through treacle, and you don't know where you're heading because it's completely unknown territory. So it's really difficult, really difficult.
Yeah, I think you've also touched on another aspect there, which is deputyship, and that is something that a lot of families do obtain in terms of not only the financial side, but also health and welfare, and that does, kind of, as you sort of said, kind of give that power back. I mean, again, that's something that, the Court of Protection would get involved in terms of making that order, and it is something that can be explored in particular circumstances. So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you sort of picked up on that as well. Chris, can we just come to you and maybe just kind of say from your perspective, you obviously mainly work within the Mental Health Act sort of arena, but you also touch upon the Mental Capacity Act and the COP arena through your kind of independent work. So how do you see sort of the safeguards of both, and how many people, for example, in the units that you look after and support are sort of covered within either of those jurisdictions?
Inpatient wise, then everyone's subject to attention to the Mental Health Act, because that's currently deemed the most appropriate tool, and part of that is around the issue of objection to care. So therefore, if there is an objection to care, then I'm oversimplifying it, but that sort of rules out dolls without sort of complicated challenges and things. The other issue is if you look into forensic services, then MCA doesn't currently cover protection of others, so risk, and again, so that therefore becomes discounted. I think the very brief points I'll make are that there's a query around the incentive for discharge, and I think that we've touched upon the ethical issue of providers whose perhaps primary focus is their profit margin. Is that too contentious to say? Or maybe it's probably too contentious for me to say. I shouldn't be saying that, should I? But I think
I'll say it.
Well, no, I'll say it. It's true, but I think that I think there are a number of things. Our admissions, we have an indicative length of stay of 18 months. So we have the CCGs have an expectation that we will be banging on their door to discharge somebody very quickly, with an expectation that even if it's a sort of a bespoke individual placement or a new cluster, then you shouldn't take more than 12 months to get that up off the ground, out of the foundations of the brickwork. So I think the incentive to discharge is somewhat beholden upon the nature of the service. Our incentive to discharge is because we have a waiting list, and if we discharge people, then we can get other people out of usually pretty grotty long-term seclusion and segregation settings. But as I said, I think that's not necessarily true of all services. It's not necessarily true of all community providers. I think I can probably, it's before the watershed, I can probably say that crap care is crap care, no matter where it is, and what we should be trying to. It's Kirsty's got a head in their hands, but we should be. That's one thing we should be trying to eradicate. I think the other thing, 2 points I'd say very quickly, because I'm aware of time and mother-in-law looking at me, is that does the Court of Protection have the ability to take on case management for an additional 80 cases a month, given that's 80-90 cases a month, given that's probably the current number of admissions to inpatient services? And also, does the Court of Protection have the capacity to take on, say, the additional 2,000 cases of the people who are currently inpatients? We talk about the Court of Protection being occasionally slow and unwieldy, but it's almost that what Ben described as the role of the Court of Protection is a bit like a very robust CTR that has a statutory power with perhaps a slightly higher level of hierarchy in terms of panel members. And I'm just going to throw that out there as my final discussion point, because I know we're running close to the end of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously an interesting point, and obviously, talking about the capacity of the Court of Protection, we don't know whether they will be able to cope with all these 2,000 cases, and certainly they equally wouldn't all come at once. We're not saying that everybody is suddenly going to tomorrow be transferred under the Mental Capacity Act and therefore want to go through the COP route. But equally, not all cases go to hearings, and we quite often, and I'm sure Ben will sort of agree, is that we quite often will agree directions between parties anyway. So you don't necessarily always need to have attended hearings and things, and we very much kind of just work collaboratively with other parties to kind of progress things through. So yeah, it's obviously interesting points, isn't it? And I think, but I think it's also not just about the Mental Capacity Act. It's also potentially about other jurisdictions. Like, I know that I've used the admin court, so I've used judicial review as a route to help people when they were detained under the Mental Health Act, which isn't necessarily, again, something which is that well known, but it stopped someone from being transferred over 200 miles away to a really inappropriate, inadequately rated ATU kind of, overnight. So we did it over a weekend, and it was very quick, but it was just an unlawful decision. And the whole point is that when these decisions are being made, you have to, I think, be more open to other kind of routes and other jurisdictions. And I think that's kind of what the sort of general take-home message is, that it's just about looking at other options. And I think that's kind of what Ben and I have been exploring, is that there are these other routes that might be appropriate, again, not for everybody and not in every circumstance, but if you have somebody who is ready for discharge, but for these community placements not being present, that's something that really should be looked into, or other restrictions which you feel that are over and above perhaps what's actually happening, or if there are just other factors which might make it appropriate, then I think it's just important, I think, to consider those sorts of things. I'm really mindful of the time, and obviously we've ran over, which is always the case, unfortunately, with these sorts of things. But I would like to just touch perhaps on some of the questions that we've been having, if everybody's okay, just to kind of carry on just a little bit more. Because we've had some really interesting and really varied questions. And we've so I'll just open up our chat if you just give me a moment. And we've had one, actually we've had lots, we've had an awful lot in fact. Let me, there's been also a lot of comments made by people who are joining about their own perspectives, and I just want to say thank you as well for sharing some of those perspectives with us and about the situations that you've been in, because it's really important to kind of have these conversations and to share them, and raise awareness as well around these sorts of things. So one is okay, so there's one around there being, actually Dr. Innes already answered that one about there being catch-22, so he's already touched upon that one, which is really helpful. Actually there's one here that maybe Ben could answer about is the reasonable adjustment of an environment, so sort of the sensory side, a legal requirement, as someone's saying, as an interior designer with a son who has been in hospitals across the country, simple educated adjustments can make a huge difference to the sensory impact. And I think we'd all sort of agree that actually sensory side of things really does kind of come through, but from the legal perspective, Ben, are you able to maybe touch on that?
Yeah, I'd like to think that you could do that, and I think one of the reasonable adjustment duties in the Equality Act, it used to be in the Disabilities Discrimination Act until the Equality Act came in, well, many years ago now. I took a case actually to the Court of Appeal about whether it was a reasonable adjustment upon a landlord to carry out interior decorating for a person. It wasn't a person with impaired capacity. It wasn't a person in a hospital setting. He was in his own home, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't do the work because he had epilepsy and he couldn't get up a ladder. And the place was really untidy and it didn't look nice to him. And we thought that it was a reasonable adjustment. We thought that it ought to qualify as a reasonable adjustment, but I'm afraid the Court of Appeal disagreed with us on this. And what it comes down to is there are some limits to what adjustments can be made to the physical features of a property. However, and in the case I took, it was about, as I say, interior decorating and just that. I noticed in the question you said you were an interior designer. Now, there probably are some, and in fact there almost certainly will be some specific adjustments that can be made to the interior of a building, and that will be a proportionate thing for a landlord or a hospital trust to do. And so I think you're along the right lines, and like most complicated questions like yours is, which are kind of just on the boundary of what, because it will depend exactly what's being requested of the hospital or the care home or whoever it is, as to whether they have to do it as a reasonable adjustment. So I can't, I'm afraid. I'd like to give you a very detailed answer. As I say, I've tried it in the past and failed, but from what the little I could see of the detail that you had on your on the question, I suspect you might be on slightly surer ground where a person is an inpatient in either a care home or in a hospital, and where you can point to a particular thing that needs to be supplied or provided or installed in a building. As I say, I think the case we took was kind of probably a little bit weaker than the facts that you're describing. There we go. So that's not a very lawyerly answer of not quite sure, but it's definitely worth looking at further, I would have thought.
No, I think that's fair enough. I just thought it was really interesting and a bit of a different question there, actually. There's also another one about what can be done when someone is detained for 3+ years. And again, I think it very much depends on your circumstances and where you're at in terms of, and also under what mechanism the person who you're talking about is being detained. So if they're under the Mental Health Act, there's obviously rights to appeal under that, but also it's about maybe looking at what the factors are that are stopping your loved one from being discharged, and trying to see if those kind of issues can be tackled. So again, it depends, because if you're talking about something like them being ready for discharge, except for, you know, them having a community package. Then it's about then trying to highlight and try and find those community providers and, you know, getting assessment. And then, you know, if it's about funding, that's obviously a different sort of stream and a different argument you might have. But again, it's about whether consideration could be given to other factors, other jurisdictions, and whether that might also be appropriate for your particular circumstances and your loved one. Does anybody else want to come in on that just before I jump to the next question? I'm trying to be brief because I know there's so many, and we're definitely not going to get to all of them, so I'm so sorry. But okay, so I think that's fine. I'm just going to pick a few more. Let me have a look. So and again, someone said, if you are in agreement that a person is ready for discharge and yet they remain in institution under section, then can it be argued that the Mental Health Act is being used to unlawfully detain a person, and should the person then be put under a DOLS? Ben, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, let me just find it so I can, because I saw that in the list that we had. We have so many questions here, everybody. This is really good, but we just haven't got long enough to answer them all. So yeah, the question is, if everyone is in agreement the person's ready for discharge and they remain in the institution, can you say that it's not that? Well, so usually what happens in my experience is that the decision that the person is ready for discharge will be contingent on. So we'll get everybody signed up. You know, the responsible clinician. And the Ministry of Justice, if they're involved in a case, will be kind of signed up in theory to saying, yeah, it's worth you guys going to look for somewhere, because if you find somewhere, then I'm likely to discharge this person. Now, no responsible clinician can say, yeah, and that assurance is good for the next 3 years, no matter what happens, because of course things might have changed. But I think that's the distinction. So it's not. It probably in those circumstances isn't ever going to be easy to say that it's unlawful for the detention under the Mental Health Act to continue, because the kind of in principle assurances that we've obtained will be in principle. They'll be yes, the doctor would support your you being discharged, but only when there is a suitable discharge destination that's been obtained that looks a little bit like this. So come back when you've found one. And so that doesn't mean, however, I think Kirsty said something about this at the start, it doesn't mean, in answer to the last bit of your question, if the conditions for detention under the Mental Health Act are not met any longer, which there might not be for all sorts of reasons, then it is often the case that a person can be deprived of their liberty under the DOL scheme in the same hospital, so that they don't get the tribunal can. Now I think it was Chris who gave the analogy earlier on that came from Lucy Series about there being a glass inside a larger glass, and when the water overflows out of the Mental Health Act glass, you just end up in under the Mental Capacity. So the Mental Capacity Act. But what we're really talking about, so I think the shortest answer I could give is that just because there is an agreement that a person should be being discharged as soon as somewhere suitable is available, of itself that doesn't mean that the Mental Health Act has no longer a role, because very often that will be contingent, that assessment by the doctors will be, yes, he or she is fit to be discharged as soon as there is somewhere, and if there isn't somewhere, then they're not fit to be discharged. So I think that's the practical way that it arises in my experience.
And Chris, did you just want to come in on that and just kind of give your views on that same question?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think there's obviously the concept of DTOC, which is shorthand for delayed transfer of care. And that is the mechanism by which if someone is identified as a delayed transfer of care, i.e. delayed discharge, hopefully, then there's a process by which, if that's not effected in a timely manner, then the local authority will be fined. Now you can say that that's frankly ludicrous, because essentially you're sanctioning the pot of cash from which you actually want to take money to discharge somebody. You know, it's maybe not, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but it does sort of seem slightly illogical. I think the other thing I'd say is that one of the issues in the Mental Health Act is this issue of what's classed as appropriate treatment. And we have what's called the appropriate treatment test. So therefore, for someone to be detained in hospital, they must be receiving appropriate treatment. Now, appropriate treatment is very, very broadly defined. At its most basic level, it's nursing care and social milieu. It doesn't necessarily need to amount to more than that. So therefore, the threshold for determining, it's not the most appropriate treatment. It's not clinically nice recommended guideline treatment. It's just appropriate treatment, which might mean that there's a service 1 mile down the road that does everything else with whistles and bells and has a huge amount more therapeutic benefit, but actually the threshold for detention is the same. So I think again it's there's a legal aspect to it, and we have to be clear about that. There's a difference between the legal aspects of the Mental Health Act and the ethical aspects of the Mental Health Act. And I think the other thing is that we also need to be mindful of the language of the Act, and that actually is not necessarily the most helpful. So I think there's a relevance to reform of certain aspects of the detention criteria, in my view, and appropriate treatment. It's how do you, it's very arbitrarily defined because it's defined at a very, very basic level.
Thank you, and that's actually really important and really interesting, and it's really good to kind of obviously get different perspectives on all these things. I'm really conscious of the time, and obviously we all have our respective children to go and sort of put to bed and things. So I think we're going to have so I think we're going to have to wrap up. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a few links into the chat bar for people to use. We've had some questions which we can definitely answer after the event. We've also going to this event is also been recorded, so you can watch it back. And again, if there are things that sort of you've got burning questions of, then do email them in, and we can try and either redirect to some resources, or we can give kind of advice about your particular circumstances. So I just want to thank the speakers so much for joining us this evening. I know we could talk for days about these issues because they are so big. And also thank you everyone for joining us this evening and giving some really important questions, and hopefully that's been some we've given some really important information across as well. So thank you so much, and good night.